Okay, so today we're going to continue with where we were. Last week we had a Purim shir, as I recall, right? I hope everybody enjoyed Purim. So today we're going to continue with where we stopped off, and I did say I was going to speak about a more modern topic at some point, but that will be help if we have a little more background for that. We talked about the Noda B'Yehuda a little bit, at least some of us after the last year. Um, the question was raised about Yibum, in a world in which there can be you can produce children, um, in circumstances where people are no longer alive, freeze the embryos and so on and so forth, and in vitro and things of that sort. So I do intend to speak about that, different views of modern post about that. But first, I want to get through where we were, because what we're doing is the principles. That's more of an application, very interesting application. And I think, as I mentioned in the aftermath of the share last time, a very tragically, a very relevant issue during this war. I'm told that a lot of young men, who were, recently married, who obviously didn't yet have time to have a family, um, and who perished in giving, their lives in service of Klal Yisrael. So this, unfortunately, it's not just a theoretical issue that happens now and then, but in our present circumstances, there are numerous cases that poskim are trying to deal with. So at some point, the request was made to discuss that, and I'm happy to do that. But first, I want to get through a couple of other principles, which are the foundations of everything else. Okay, so I think we were discussing the Tosos on Daf Yud Amud Aleph, which is here in the Marmakomos, I believe, on page 3. And if you have a Shas Gemara, it's on Daf Yud Amud Aleph itself. So let me get to that. And the case was, so I'm just going to give you the background of the case, and then I want to contrast the positions of the Ramban and the Bali Tosos and try to connect it. So again, what we've been doing is taking a few cases to try to examine the relationship between two different themes. So again, the background is that the Mishnah says that there are 15 arayos, and these 15 are all excluded from Yibam and Chalitza, and even the co-wives are excluded, as we've been discussing. Now, all of these cases have two things, two elements, and the question is, what is the relationship between them? So on the simplest level, they're all at least chayve krisos or more, meaning they all are severe transgressions which would not justify performing the act of Yibum, because when you encounter a transgression, so we have rules. Ase dochalos ase, for example, which means a positive commandment overrides a negative one. But a positive commandment doesn't override a negative commandment that also carries with it a capital punishment. That's called ein ase dochalos ase sheish bakares. And therefore, on a certain simple level, the 15 cases of the Mishnah cannot, be cases of Yibum, because there's no legal halachic, in other words, justification for proceeding with the Yibum given the severity of the transgression, and therefore the Yibum is disqualified. However, there's another element to all of this, and that is, in addition to the factual clash, that would take place in the act of Yibum, which would make, this mitzvah not defensible, there's another dimension, and that is that the reason, that there's such severe punishment in these cases and these transgressions is because the relationships are illicit, meaning these are relationships that are inappropriate, for marriage. So, for example, it could be a person. One of the cases of the Mishnah is his daughter. Another case is his wife's sister. So, is he going to marry his, brother's wife when his brother dies prematurely without leaving an heir? For the sake of the honor of his brother, is he going to do that and trample upon, the very delicate and very important existential bond that he has with his wife by, in other words, let's say two brothers married two sisters. This is a very popular case especially in the third parak of Yevamos. Two brothers can marry two sisters. It happens all the time. So, but the point is that, even if that didn't happen in a normal situation, as we discussed, as long as a wife is alive, even if she has been divorced, her sister is off limits. So this would be the question. Let's say, you had two brothers married two sisters, and that's one of the cases of the Mishnah. And then, brother number one, Ruvain, let's say, died. Ruvain was married to Leah. Shimon was married to Rachel, and Ruvain dies. So what are we going to say? That Shimon should be miyabim, Leah, despite the fact that violates, his relationship with his, existing wife, Rachel, for the sake of his deceased brother. So obviously, in addition to the prohibition which precludes Yibum, I say there's also, before you get to that even, whenever we're dealing with, hardcore erva, which carries with it a capital offense or capital punishment, we're also typically forgetting about the punishment and the inability to override that. The bigger question is there's just an inappropriate relationship here. These are all relationships which, for example, if he tried to go about them outside of Yibum, would not work. Meaning, there's no tfisas kiddushin. If he were to be mekadesh espito, he could have as many guests as he wants. Obviously, that would be obscene. Even if it's something that's not obscene, like he was trying to be mekadesh, achos ishto, even after he divorced his wife, but he's trying to marry her sister, but she's still alive, that would not be chal. That's not chai b'lav, and that's chai b'krisus. So it's not just more severe; it's also a relationship that is not implementable. So when we talk about the 15, arayos of the Mishnah, really we could examine, the disqualification of Yibum on two different levels. One is that the act of Yibum is too much of a transgression because you encounter, the Isser Kares and so on, and there's no Asadokolos Asay under those conditions. But even before you get to that, if the candidate is a real hardcore erva from Parshas Achrimos and Kedoshim, so there's no Tfisas Kedushin, and there should just be no candidacy. It's not just that you can't implement it before you even get to the implementation stage. It's just a relationship which is untenable and which is inconceivable. So now the question is, can we isolate those factors from each other? Can we find cases where, from a technical Yibum versus the transgression point of view, we could justify this action, but there still might be a relationship problem? What about in the other direction? Can it be a situation where maybe the implementation isn't the problem, but maybe the stature or the status of the relationship is still inconceivable? So we already discussed last week, we were discussing Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva holds that Chai V'Lavin produce a mamzer, not just the Chai V'Krisus. We don't paskin like Rabbi Akiva, but that's what Rabbi Akiva holds. And Rabbi Akiva also holds that there's no tfisas kiddushin for Chai V'Lavin. And what we were discussing was Tosas's question, fine, how is it that the Gemara assumes that because there's no tfisas kiddushin and there's mamzeris for Rabbi Akiva, there's also no yibam and chalitza, why not still apply the principle of asi aseh v'dachi los aseh? Because Rabbi Akiva believes in that general rule. So here you have a situation where, on the level of the clash of the actual, implementation of Yibum, there should be a justification to move forward, according to Rabbi Akiva, against, the evidence of the Gemara. On the other hand, according to Rabbi Akiva, this is an illicit relationship that could not be replicated in the context of marriage. There's no tfisas kiddushin, and it's so illicit that it would have engendered a status of mamzerus. So that's obviously, a red line, big red line. And therefore, the debate in this, Tosas doesn't answer this question, because Bali Tosas are mostly interested in question number one. Namely, can you implement Yibum in a legal way. They're less concerned with the nature of the relationship that will ensue. Whereas the Rambam and the Ramban and that group seem to be, either equally interested in both issues or even more interested in the question of the partnership or the
Does it
character
relate to
of the
Chuya and
Ishus.
Keturah?
And as such, the character of the Ishus is the main concern. That if there's erva, even if there, isn't, even if there is atzli dokalos, I'll say that would still not solve the problem. And
Does it
that's kind
relate?
of what Tosa Rosh and Ramban say. Yeah.
Does it relate to your feelings about the Chuya and Keturah? Whether you hold that it's the Chuya or not.
Yes, I do think so, very much so. Yeah. Meaning, I think the Bali Tosis who are inclined to Dechuya in general are looking at Yibum not so much as this is what I call a Kedushas Isha Shel Yibum. They're looking at it in terms of there's a mitzvah, it accomplishes a certain goal, Lahakim Lakiv Shem Be Yisrael. And the question is it legal and valid to do it or not? It's Dechuya anyway, meaning Eshesach is always hovering, and therefore this is never ideal. But obviously, the benefit outweighs the the obstacle, and therefore, as long as the benefit outweighs the obstacle legally, meaning you have the equivalent of ase dochalos ase, or if you were to say ase dochalos ase sheish bakares, then you would even say it in Erva, says Tos is very impressed with that, and I think 100% that is a part of the Dechuya mentality that they have. However,
but if you hold that it's not an issur to begin with,
like Kutra,
then why would you not say that, in for a penny, in for a pound, to be not
no,
nice?
because I think the reason that it's not an Isur, the reason that it's Hutra is because we look, I'll say it my way. I don't know if everybody goes as far as I'm going, what I call super Hutra, but what I'm trying to say is for the very same reason, when there's no Yibum, that it's an egregious betrayal, to marry your brother's, wife. Like, let's say the brother divorces.
Oh, less egregious than the other 15.
No, in all the cases of the 15.
No,
100%.
so what I'm saying
We're
is
talking about Hutra.
once you push it away, once it doesn't exist, why should it exist for the 15 other Arabs?
Right. So I'm explaining that when it comes to the institutional clash, right, which is between Eshesach and Yibum, the transition is as follows. The idea is that to the extent that this is an egregious offense because it's a betrayal of your brother in a situation where there's no Yibum circumstance, in that very same way, it is a tribute to him and a way of not blotting, but on the contrary, a way of permanently securing his memory and his legacy, right, in a circumstance where he dies and leaves no children. But that consideration is not true for the other Ervas, meaning because if it's his daughter, that the flexibility you could say about the wife's brother, that it's all about the relationship to the brother, and therefore,
that might be a cultural.
Let me just finish saying it. If it's gratuitous, then it's egregious, and if it's for his honor, then not only is it not egregious, it's the opposite. It's in his honor and it's for his legacy.
One say
But
that.
let me just finish the sentence. But if it's his daughter, or it's in addition, in other words, or it is his mother-in-law, or it's his stepmother, right? Then as much good as he's doing to benefit, his deceased brother, that doesn't change the inconceivable, harm that he is doing to his father, to his, daughter, etc. So that
because there is another party that's being hurt by this, and it's not just the husband, so we can't offset because another party, not because it's a worse erva, because
it's not a worse erva. It's
not a worse erva.
It's just that the yibum has nothing to do. You could say that my view of Hutra, my preferred view of Hutra, I'm not saying everybody holds this way, the broadest view of Hutra is the idea that, and it comes out a little bit from the Gemara in the Dalet Amud Beis that we read about a month ago, which is it's the idea that the same basis for the Iser of Eshasach is the basis for the mitzvah of Yibum, namely Ki Yeshvu Achim Yakta. That works when there are children, and when the brother is still alive, or when the brother is still alive, then that relationship with the brother totally militates against any kind of relationship with his even ex-wife or his former wife if he dies but he has children. But the second that there are no children and he dies, right? So that very factor, namely his brother's, the sensibility towards his brother and his brother's legacy, is compelling reason to move ahead with Yibum. If you say it that way, it's Hutra, it's not Techuya, meaning the problem of Eishes Ach, evaporates. It's what would be a problem ends up being a compelling reason to move forward.
They also explain why the Torah, many if not all the cases, explains why this erva is knaf of, in other words, it says who you are hurting.
Right, exactly. And I think that is so critical. It's knaf aviv, it's a choso, it's right. It's not just that objectively.
Otherwise, it's almost gratuitous, those comments in the Torah, if you think about it. Yeah, right. I mean, we have to be told that it's a. But I guess the point
and it's so interesting. You have
what you're saying right now is that the reason that this is so egregious is the party that you're doing the damage to, and in the case of Yibum, that party is offset by the good that you're doing for him.
Right, or not even offset, but it's even more than offset. It's like the circumstances are so different that they're like two different, worlds. But you don't have that when you have Bito in a mix, or you have, aim, aim Ishto or things of that sort, or even Achos Ishto. So that's kind of where we are. So now, having discussed Rabbi Akiva, we move to Eishes Ish. So Eishes Ish is such an interesting, curious case, because what do you mean Eishes Ish? Eishes Ish means a wife, a married woman, right? So what's the din of what is Eishes Ish and Erva? Sure, it's in Parshas Achremos and in Kedoshim in the Erva Parsha. It's a capital crime, but the problem, it's a different kind of Erva.
It's even worse than Kores.
It's not yet. It's Chiyuv Misas Beza, but it's a different kind of. It's not a relative. It's not an illicit relationship that you're hurting, your brother, your mother, or you're related, through them, and therefore it's too. It's almost like a it's almost like an incestuous relationship. It's not that. It's you're violating someone else's marriage. Right, but it's still an achremos and kedosh. So we'll get back to that part of it. The fact that it's not as a relative or damaging a relative, but it's more, the egregiousness comes from the betrayal of marriage. We'll get back to that. But of course, the bigger question is, like, what do we talk? How could you have a case of Eishes Ish that's Yibum? The whole idea of Yibum, of course, is that the brother died. If the brother died, how is she an Eishes Ish? What would be the case? So the Gemara, it's based on the Gemara in Gittin. I'm going to read it inside in just a minute. But the Gemara in Gittin says the following. There's a machlokas between Rabbi Lazar and the Chachamim in two cases. One is a person says, Harayat mutaris l'chol adam, Harayat megureshes, v'harayat mutaris l'chol adam, chutz miploni. So let's take, Abram is married to Sarah. Abram wants to divorce Sarah, but he doesn't want Sarah to marry Shimon.
That's not
for whatever reason. Okay? Sincere reason, insincere reason, vendetta, whatever, it doesn't make a difference. So Abram says to Sarah, I am divorcing you vis-a-vis the rest of the world. You can marry anybody you want after this divorce, but you cannot marry Shimon. From the perspective of Shimon, you are still married to me. Can he do that? Can he impose that condition? No. So I'm sorry?
not creases.
Forget about creases. It's even worse than that. The Gemara says that it's the heter of Haret Muteres requires that it be from Chol Adam. Anyways, there's one view in the Gemara that the Mishnah in the beginning of the last parak of Gittin, the ninth parak of Gittin, parak HaMegaresh, there's one view that says that is a machloket between Rabbi Lazar and the Chachamim. The other view in the Gemara says, no. Even Rabbi Lazar agrees. You can't say Hareat Muteres l'Chol Adam chutz mishimon. But what you could do, maybe, and this is a Krisa's problem, you'll see in a moment, is say Hareat Migureshes Almanas Shelo Tinasi l'Shimon. Like, let's say, make a condition. I say that I'm giving you this get, but there's one condition, right? The condition is not that you should give me $100, and it's not that you should sell me your home. The condition is that you never marry Shimon. If you marry Shimon, then that undercuts the condition, and if that undercuts the condition, then it'll turn out in retrospect that you're still married to me. You're an Eish Ish. That's called Harei at Megureshes li Almanas Shelo Tinasi Liploni, or in this case, Shimon. So that's the case that the Balitosis zero in on. What happened here? Avram's married to Sarah, correct? Avram divorces Sarah and says, Almanas Shelo Tinasi L'Shimon. Why did I pick Shimon and not Reuven? I want to make it clear. Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Okay? So he says, if you marry Shimon, then the get is off, and you're an Eish Ish.
Yeah, but you can't make a Tanai on a get. A Tanai on a get doesn't work.
Really? Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
No strings.
If you're right, then if you're right, then we're gonna have to cut out 15 pages of Masachet Gittin and about 5 of Masachet Kiddushin.
Really, you're allowed to make conditions on a get?
Yes, but not all conditions, but some conditions. Meaning, Parak Misha of the 7th Parak of Gittin. I'll tell you that in Shas, to explain what I just said, in Shas there are 2 main discussions about conditions. There are many discussions about conditions. It's a Shas topic. But the 2 most extensive discussions, one is in Masechet Kiddushin in the 3rd parak, Parak HaOmer, and the other is in the 7th parak of Gittin, Parak Misha Achazo. So yes, you can make a Tanai in a get. What you can't do in a get, and that's what Andy was referring to before, is according to many, if the condition isn't something that ends at a certain clear point, but it lingers on and it gives the previous husband control over her in an indefinite way, so that might be a violation of the principle of krisus, because the Torah says that a get is sefer krisus, and sefer krisus, the drasha is it should be which is where you're coming from, Jacob. It should be a davar hakores beino levena, meaning it should end their relationship in a definitive way. It's very unhealthy, right, for there to continue to be any kind of strings being pulled by the husband, after the divorce. So if the divorce is contingent upon a very well-defined condition, and assuming there's nothing wrong with that condition, then yes, you can have a get al tanai. You absolutely can. There are many Gemaras in in Masachet Gittin, especially in the 7th parak, and a bunch of Gemaras in the 3rd parak of Kiddushin, that speak about, Kiddushin al tanai and get al tanai. Absolutely. That's not a problem. However, if the condition...
That's the guy who says that if 30 days he doesn't come back and he's on the other side of the river.
Yeah, we discussed that even in Ksubas, right? I mean, the guy says, I'll give you a get on condition, that I don't return in 30 days. Or I do return.
He's on the other side of the water and he can't get across.
And then he's on the other party saying, Chazi vasai, right? Saying, here I am, but I can't get over the bridge. So that would...
We had that case. We learned that in our library before the renovation.
Yeah. That's a case in Ksubis and in Gittin. It's called onus b'tanai, meaning if you can't fulfill the condition, or if you do fulfill the condition, but out of compulsion, not out of free choice. Anyways, of course there are tanai in Gittin, but there shouldn't be a tanai that undercuts krisus ben elavena, according to most. And there's a question whether or not if he says chutz miploni, which is like a shi or a beget, shin yud vav resh, he leaves, it's not a full, pardon or full open license. Like he retains some aspect of his Eishasish. So this is the debate between Rabbi Lazar and the Chacham. The Gemara in Amagaresh discusses, are they arguing about the more innocuous case, but still a problem case of Almanas, or are they even arguing in a case of Chutz Miploni? Okay, so Tosas assumes that they're arguing there about Almanas, and Tosas says then you have the following circumstance. And the Yerushalmi already in Gittin says this as well. What happens? Abraham and Sarah are married, right? Not happily. So they get a divorce. But Abraham imposes a condition on this divorce. He says, Almanash shalotinasi l'Shimon. Who's Shimon? Some guy not related to him, but Shimon happens to be the brother of Reuven. Okay, so she goes out and she doesn't marry Shimon because she doesn't want any trouble. What does she do instead? She marries Reuven, Shimon's brother. Then, of course, we're not saying this happened. We're saying this could happen. We were wondering what would happen if this happened. Reuven dies and leaves no children. So now she is a Yibum candidate to Shimon, the guy who is identified as being off limits in the get. So of course, this is very tricky. She cannot be misyavemes to Shimon, right, as a Yibum, because, notwithstanding the fact that Shimon's brother Reuven just died and she was legitimately married to him, because if she consummates, right, an Ishus Kinyan with Shimon, it rewrites history, and it turns out that she is still married to Abraham. So that will be a violation of Eishasish, right? Moreover, if she were to go ahead with this, not only would she trigger the Eishas Ish status of Abraham and Sarah, she would have rewritten history so that she was never, or they would have rewritten history so that she was really never married to Reuven. Because once you reinstate the marriage because of the violation of the condition between Abraham and Sarah, so then the Kiddushin that she accepted from Reuven, which we thought made her a Yibum candidate to Shimon, never happened because she was a married woman at the time.
Because the Kiddushin wouldn't be Chal. So there's no problem with the marriage to Reuven.
I mean, there wouldn't be a marriage to
Shimon
Reuven.
would not be Chal, so nothing would happen to the proper marriage to Reuven. Because they could do, if she decides to marry Shimon, which that the Kiddushin would not be Chal, right?
The Kiddushin to Shimon and the Kiddushin to Reuven.
No, because if the Kiddushin to Shimon is not Chal, then we don't have to worry about Reuven.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, I'm just saying what I'm explaining. You have to account for the hypothetical case in order to explain why none of this can happen. You understand? Okay.
And we can't invoke Brera.
No. There's nothing. I mean, in general, you're asking a good question, but in general, the relationship between T'nai and Brera is a complicated issue. Meaning, why isn't every T'nai Brera? Right? Brera, just for everybody's edification, is a concept that we find that sometimes when things unfold in a certain way, and they progress and they lead to a certain result, we sometimes say yesh brera, which is that it was always destined, to happen that way, and therefore, we see the roots or the seeds of that change already in the past, in retrospect. But this is a question that Rishonim ask in a bunch of places, in Darim, in Sanhedrin. Like, what is the relationship between three things? But we're not going to discuss it now, just to be aware. Asmachta, what we call asmachta, which is usually a guzma,
You don't really believe it.
exaggeration. But you say, you make some condition, but it's not a serious condition. A regular tanai, a condition, and breira. Right. So there are all sorts of the Balitosis, the Ramban, they have all sorts of Rambam have different parameters, like when do you apply asmakta, when do you apply tanai, when do you apply breira. Okay. But let's leave that aside for the moment. So this is Tosas's question.
How can
Tosas is
Abraham
saying,
take precedent over the Raisa Chova Shel Yevum?
Say what? Say that one more time.
How can a Tnai made by Abraham take precedent over a Chok Midaraisa, which is Yevum?
Because it's not taking precedent, it just creates a different reality. The gerushin between Avram and Sarah took place 20 years before the Yibum situation. And it created a reality that, if you try to do Yibum, then you might be triggering, her status as Eishes Ish. It's a Tanai, a condition, has legal effect. So it's not correct to formulate it as a clash between Yibum and Tanai. The Tanai creates a legal reality, which in turn dictates whether the conditions for Doraisa, for Minatora Yibum, do or don't apply. In this situation, what we're saying is that, if Abraham's divorce of Sarah was conditional upon her having no relationship with Shimon, right, then that is going to interfere willy-nilly with any yibum between, Sarah and Shimon, because in reality, the T'nai impacts on a biblical level as well the relationships. So she's not a yibum candidate, because if you were to go ahead with the yibum, right, then she would be an Eishes Ish, and she wouldn't, and she would be an Eishes Ish, and she also wouldn't be a Yavama. Okay, now, when you think about this case and this question, so what is Tosas asking? Tosas is asking the question, like, why is this not in our Mishnah? Why aren't there 16 Erevos? The 15 of the Mishnah and the 16th also from Parshas Achremos, Eishes Ish. So you'll say, oh, how can there ever be a case of Yibum that confronts Eishes Ish? The whole point of Yibum is that she is a free woman, she's not a free woman, but she's no longer married. She was married to Ruvain, and now Ruvain died. So where's the Eishes Ish? So that's why the ingeniousness of this case is, the obstacle for her to proceed to Yibum with Shimon, the obstacle is that if you do that, you would be triggering her status of Eishes Ish. And if you did that, then there would be no possibility of Yibum, because she's an Eishes Ish. And not only that, there would actually be no possibility of Yibum, because it would have turned out that she was never married to Reuven. Right? Okay. So let's look at Tosas now. Tosas takes this question very seriously. The Ramban, by extension, thinks it's, kind of a mischievous question, but nothing too serious. Just look for a minute at the Ramban, because it's shorter. This is probably on page 3. So it's Kedusha Ramban Masachet Yevamos Daf Beis Amud Aleph. It says Masnisin Chamesh Esrei Nashim Potros Saroseim. So the Ramban says Rabboseinu HaTzarfatim, the French rabbis, meaning the Tosfists, Hikshu, they asked the following question: Bilisni Tezayin, shouldn't there be 16 ervas? Why not add one to the Mishnah? Kagon, for example, Megarishas Ishto, right? Sarah divorces, Avram divorces Sarah. Almanas Shalotina, he has Reuben and Shimon, opposite of the way I put it. Doesn't make a difference. Almanas Shalotinasi LeReuven, right? Avram divorces Sarah on condition that she not, remarry Reuven. The whole V'nisas l'Shimon, she's agreeing with that. So she goes and instead she gets married to Reuven's brother Shimon. Umeis, and then Shimon dies. V'nafla liftei Reuven, and now she is in a Yibum candidacy with Ruvain, who, if she, in theory, if she were to go through with it, would revise her whole history and bring back her status as Eshes Ish. Demigud hi asura, sarasa asura alav. Since she cannot become Mrs., according to Ramban, Mrs. Reuven, in my case, Mrs. Shimon, it doesn't make a difference. So her tsara is also excluded. So the Ramban says about this question, Afal bishazu kusha shel kantor, demasnisin tnoin loktani. Says, number one, this is a mischievous question. To think of this question requires a lot of knowledge and ingenuity, right? You get a bit of a headache trying to say, somebody says to you, like, I need you to construct a case where a Yibum candidate should be disqualified because she's a married woman, right? A married woman, Yibum is all about her husband dying. How could she be a married woman? So you're worried, you're gonna honestly, say, oh, it's shocking that the Mishnah left out this case. It's such a unusual, rare case. You have to be, ingenious. I don't know if you have to be a genius, but you have to be ingenious, in calculations, to come up with this kind of a scenario.
Would
right?
the same thing be in effect if she had at one time made a neder never to marry Reuven?
No, well, I mean, again, if she's noderes, yeah, we do have that. That's a Gemara later on in Kuf Yud Aleph. That a noderes, but noderes is not Eshes Ish. That would be an Asay and Alav. That would be the equivalent of Almana Lekohen Gadol, the Gemara says. We'll talk about that. Gemara seems to say that a noderes.
The neder changed maybe in that case.
What?
Get the Torah she get the neder.
Yeah, number one, it's subject to a Torah Sadarim, and number two, it's not erva. It's a lav and an asay. But the Gemara does speak about it on Kuf Yud Aleph, and the Rajba is very into that case. And even in this sugya, well, when we get to the Rajba, you'll see he talks about noderes. But it's not the same as Eshes Ish exactly. But it is a very good. Anyway, you see the Ramban's first thing Ramban's saying is, if you're worried about the Mishnah, it's just mischievous. It's such a contorted case. They don't have to talk about this.
You won't find a case like this in Chuvas of any of the Rishonim. Actually,
I mean, you would do because of this, because it's whatever.
But I'm saying actual case where somebody came.
Yeah. The actual case is not likely, to happen. It can happen, but it would be, again, the coincidence, the contortions would have to be considerable.
You win the lottery easier.
Yeah. So I'm going to first read I'm going to do this out of historical order. It's running a little late, but just because the Ramban is much easier, and then I want to contrast Tosas. Tosas is far, far more difficult to read here, which is usually not the case. But I want to contrast them. So the Ramban says about this, number one, asking for the Mishnah is mischievous because it's such a contorted case. But then as for the case, let's say it would happen, what would be the halacha? Says the Ramban, Aval nirali bedina. As far as the din is concerned, I don't think that's such a big problem or controversial matter either. Why? Shetzarasa misyabemes. The co-wife should be a Yibum candidate. We shouldn't treat this like erva. Why? She'ein zu tsaras erva klal elagrusha gemura. When you think about it, is she an Eshes Ish when she stands as a candidate for Yibum? No, she's Migureshes from Abraham. Until she does something, that's prohibited, right? Namely, she has a physical relationship with Shimon, right? She's not an Eshes Ish. She's a Grusha and an Almana. She's the Grusha of Abraham and the Almana of Reuven, his brother, right? Of course, if you're calculating, whether to go through with it or not, and if you go through with it, what havoc that would wreak in the history of these people's relationship, then you're totally right. There's an Eshes Ish factor. But the Ramban says, legally, she's not an Eshes Ish.
Man-made. doesn't exist by itself. It's a
What does the
man.
Ramban really care about? The answer is the Ramban. No, the Ramban's not arguing that she could be Misyavemes. He agrees she can't be Misyavemes. But what he's saying is there's no Ptur Tzara because she's not an Erva, because while technically if she would try to be Misyavemes, it would trigger Eishes Ish. Until that happens, and because it can't happen, we look at her as a Grusha who can't do Yibum. There's no Erva and there's no Ptur. That's what she, Ela Grusha Gemura Eitzel Ruvain, Kishar Hol Oanoshim. So what about the fact that she practically cannot, implement Yibum? Umishum Tnai Bialma Asura Alav. Shelo Yivatel Zgita Bimenu Mikol Adam. That's for practical reasons. That's why your question about Noderis is a good question. The Rajba equates this Tnai and Noderis, because he holds like the Ramban, but meaning that it isn't really Eishes Ish.
The Ramban separating man-made problems from inherent problems, because the regular errors are inherently a problem. Nobody has to do anything. You're born with that problem. So
well, I'll say it this way, but I think you're right. But in the cases of the Mishnah, the candidate is the problem, not the implementation only. Meaning it's his daughter. She can't be a Yibum candidate, and it's his wife's sister, Achos Ishto. She cannot be a Yibum candidate. However, here the problem isn't that the woman, and in her present state, is an Erva. She's an Eishes Ish and can't be a Yibum candidate. The problem is you just cannot implement the Yibum. So for Balitosis, which I'm going to show you in a minute, that's a serious problem, because for them, they're Dechuya people. They're always worried about whether or not Lemaisa you can implement the Yibum, yes or no. But the Ramban is not. Ramban's a Chutra person. For him, the biggest issue is not can you implement the Yibum. The issue is there an appropriate candidate? As a couple, are this an appropriate Yibum couple? So the answer in the Mishnah, the answer is no. Not just because Lemaisa, if they would go ahead, there wouldn't be a heter. They're not allowed to go ahead because they're an illicit relationship, and that's not marriage material. But is this woman here marriage material? The answer is theoretically she is. But if you try to go there, then you're gonna revise her personal history, and it's not going to work. So the Ramban says, right, that's why you can't do it, but that doesn't make it an erva. She's not Eishes Ish, and therefore there's no Ptur Tzara. You understand what I'm saying? Ad kedei kach that the Ramban goes even further. Before we get to that, first he says, Vim Tomar Eina Kegrusha Atzlo. Right? If you want to start thinking that maybe she's an Eishes Ish, he's saying, so then you have a bigger problem. Namely, if she's really an Eishes Ish, then she's not a Yavama. Because if she's the wife of Avraham, then she was never married to Reuven. Havalat Sarasa, Tsaras Erva, Shalom Mokom Mitzvah, the Lorami Erva, Kameli Yibum. Right? If you don't want to say that she's a Grusha, you want to say she's an Eishes Ish, then there's no Yibum anyway. Because she never married Reuven. Elashi Grusha Etzlag, Vada Kidprecious, the Achisa Begitin. Miu, says the Ramban, because he's so number one, he dismissed the question from the Mishnah was, that's a mischievous question. It's so far from happening. Mishnah's not going to talk about that. Number two, on the substance of it, it's not a really serious problem. She's not an Eishes Ish, she's a Grusha. She's a Grusha where practically you can't do Yibum. So now the question is, if she's only a Grusha where practically you can't do Yibum, but it's not a fundamental flaw, it's just a practical limitation that excludes Yibum. What about Chalitza? Maybe she should be obligated in Chalitza. After all, maybe there's a Zika. Maybe, you could do Chalitza.
There's no Grusha, you're back to where you started from.
No. Why is that? Chalitza doesn't.
If she needs Chalitza.
No. It says Shalotinasi the Zika is not a marriage, right? The Yibum would be a marriage. The Zika is not a marriage.
Now that you brought this up, maybe Shalot Tinase doesn't include Yibum.
Yeah, that's something to think about. But the Rishonim, the Yerushalmi and the Bavli do not go there. But that is a great point. You could have said that. But so listen to the next line.
All the cases of Erva have Chalitza. What happens with all the cases of Erva? All the 15 cases of Erva.
No Chalitza. No Chalitza. That's the point. So listen to this. Miu b'shenef, that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ein cholzin ve'ein misyabnim, and there's a Patur Tzara. So listen to the Ramban. Miu b'shenaf lo lefan of levada. Let's say there are no tzaros, and there's just her. So ani mesupak, says the Ramban. I'm not sure. Im tzricha chalitza mimeno. Kiven de migureshes etzlo, because he says my whole claim is she's not an Eishasish, right? She'll only become an Eishasish if he does Yibum. Until he does Yibum, and we're looking at her as a candidate, he's not an Eishasish. So then maybe there's Zika, and maybe there should be a requirement of Chalitza. Why does he say only in a case where there's only one wife? Meaning, if there's more than one wife, so you can do Chalitza or Yibum with the other one, since there's no Patur Tzara, so you don't have to get into this. But if she's the only one, if she's not an erva, then maybe you need chalitza. Or maybe kivin she'ein ola liyibum in ola chalitza. We have a rule on the Gimel and elsewhere that says, kol she'ein ola liyibum ein ola chalitza, kol she'ein ola, kol she'ola liyibum ola chalitza. So if you can't split that, we do have some cases where we split it.
Don't we have some drabanan sfekes?
No. Right. Rabbanans or Safek.
She needs a divorce and the chalitza.
Yeah, but that's midrabana or Safek, because we're not sure whether or not she really. Safek.
The real essence here is there's no Safek here.
There's no Safek, right? Meaning he wants to know vadai, not Safek. Meaning is if the problem is you just can't do yibum, but really there's a zika, then maybe you should need a chalitza. So then he says v'chein nira. In my opinion, if there's no yibum, there's no chalitza. Hela shetzarich Talmud. He says, I don't think that the matter is so clear. If you look at the Rajba, we'll not read it. We'll read it next time, hopefully. If you look at the Rajba disagrees with Ramban on this final point. He says, in my opinion, you do need chalitza minatorah. Okay?
Minatorah?
Minatorah, you need chalitza in this case of Tanai, because it's just a technicality that, you can't do the Yibum, because if you do, you're going to revise her history and so on. But until you get to, when you're looking at them as, are they a compatible couple in theory because of status? Is she an erva? No, she's a grusha. So if she's a grusha, but lemaisa, you can't do Yibum because that would trigger all this cascade of, revisionist history or revisionist stature or status, right? So then, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a zika. She's a Yibum candidate. She just can't lemaisa do before. You can't do Yibum. So the Rajba says, the Ramban is mistake.
How does the Rajba deal with the fact that the Gemara says if you can't do Yibum, you can't do chalitza?
Right. So the Rajba says there's more than one exception to that, and this is going to be one of the exceptions. Everybody agrees. It seems the Chuvas Raj. We'll get to it, but most people agree that there's at least one exception to that rule, and that is when you have an asay and a lav together, like an almana l'kohen gadol, almana nesua l'kohen gadol is an asay and a lav, and the Gemara seems to say that there's chalitza d'oraisa, even though there's no yibum. So the Rajba thinks you can expand that to a bunch of other cases too, including this case. And the Ramban is mistapek, but the Ramban says, no, I think the rule maybe has one exception, or that exception, is singular for a reason. We'll discuss it when we get to it. But the broad rule is wins the day. It's not, there aren't so many exceptions. But what emerges is that according to the Ramban and the Rajba, what they're saying is, what's driving them? What's really driving them is the idea that implementing Yibum isn't the main point. It's the main point in whether you are able to do Yibum, but it's not the main point in whether there's a Zika. The bigger point is the compatibility, the propriety, right, of the relationship. So if you have an erva, in addition to there's no excuse because even before you get to that, you're not going to say hutra when you have an erva. It's just not appropriate. You can't have a man marry his daughter or marry his wife's, sister, even for the same purpose of yibum. So it's not just you can't do it. It's the reason you can't do it, and that it's a severe violation, is because this is an incompatible and appropriate couple. Says the Ramban, but if you're looking at it that way, not, can you do it, but are they an inappropriate couple? If she's not an Eishes right now, she's a Grusha. She's not an inappropriate candidate. She's just a candidate that, in practice, you could never do Yibam with. But in practice, not because she's incompatible legally and formally, because she's not an Eishes. But according to the Baalei Tosas, I'll show you in a minute, Tosas worked so hard on this case. If you look at the Tosas here on Yudam Aleph, the very long Tosas, much longer than the Ramban. And it's a complicated Tosas. So, and half of Tosas's conclusion is, it could have been in the Mishnah, or at least there probably is a P'tur Tzara. Wow. Because Tosas mostly, it's not so simple to them that the problem of candidacy, and how, antithetical or appropriate, that is to the Ishus of you. For Tosas, that's not the main point. The bigger point, there's a mitzvah called Yibum, L'Hakim L'Hakim Shem B'Yisrael. There's still a question when you want to power through and implement that mitzvah. So can you do that? If there's also a transgression, the answer is, that gets you like in Aseh Dochalos Aseh. What about Aseh Dochalos Aseh V'Aseh? What about Aseh Docha Aseh? What about Aseh Docha Lav Sheish Bakares? Right? And here it gets you to a problem of, if you were to go ahead and do the Ibum, you'd end up violating Eishes Ish, and you wouldn't accomplish Ibum anyway, because she wouldn't even be a Yavama. So the Baalei Tosas think this is a really serious problem. It's really comparable to the other cases. In the other cases, the biggest point is not how proper, the Yibum or qualified the Yibum couple is from a Kedusha point of view. The biggest question there, or maybe the only question there, is can you pull off Yibum to accomplish L'Hakim L'Achiv Shem, given the halachic rules of what's doka and what's not doka. So here, Eishes Ish is going to be a problem, even though she's not, when you look at her, prior to anything happening, she's not an Eishes Ish, she's a Grusha. But since the implementation, would be Asr because of Eishes Ish, so that disqualifies this for Yibum. Or no, maybe it doesn't. If it does, then maybe it should be a P'tur Tzara too. Maybe it should be in the Mishnah. Maybe it's really not much different than Achos Ishto or Bito. So let's look at Tosas. We'll stop in a few minutes. Actually, I have to speak somewhere tonight, which is why I'm here. La'olam leisle l'Rebbe hani klali plukta kamairi. Everybody have Tosas on Yud Ben Aleph? It's also in the Marmakal. Bim Tomar, Tosas asks. Lisni Eishes Ish Poteris Tzarasa. Why not include in the Mishnah a case of a married woman, Eishes Ish, which is in Parshas Arayos, and say that if there are any co-wives, that they're going to be exempted too, like the other Arayos. Kigon, what does that mean? What's the case? The Amala Reza Gita Chamana Shelo Tinasi Leploni. Avram says to Sarah, I'm divorcing you, but don't marry Shimon. The pligi b'magaresh is an argument in Perek HaMagaresh. Rabbi Lazar v'Rabbanan argued, Dil Rabbi Lazar have a get. Yasur leploni. Rabbi Eliezer says that it's not nice, but if he imposes this condition, it's a valid condition, and she can never marry Ploni, because if she were to marry Ploni, she'd turn back into an Eshes Ish, and then there wouldn't be Chal, and so on, and there would be a Chiv Misa. Bimdi says Sla'achiv. So she went ahead after this Tanai, and she, was trying to mind her P's and Q's, I guess they say. So she didn't marry Shimon, she married Reuven, his brother. But then the Hashgacha intervened, Umeis, and Reuven died. And now she is facing Shimon as a Gibum candidate, and she has some co-wives. So why not say Poteris Tsarasa as an Eshes Ish? And Erva, her co-wives and her should be excluded from Yibam and Chalitza all across the board. Even though midrabanan, we say in such a case, she shouldn't marry anybody. Because as long as there's this Tanai hanging over her head, let's say she marries somebody and then she goes out and she marries Shimon. So then it'll turn out that her marriage with the fellow in between, like Reuven, was a violation of Eshes Ish. Meaning until Abraham dies, or until Shimon dies, it's not really safe for her to marry anybody in between. Because if in the end she breaks the Tanai, by marrying Shimon, she's going to ruin the lives of the interim husbands, of the the in-between husbands as well. But that's only a din d'Rabban. So Tosa says, Afilu Rabbi Eliezer midrabanan, you're not allowed to get married to anyone ad sheyamas hamagaresh o haploni, until either the husband, meaning Avram, dies, or until Shimon dies. Maybe she'll marry somebody else, and then should tisalmin o tiskarish mizeh, and then she'll either get divorced from that middle one or be widowed by him. And if she has children, and then she marries Shimon, right, then nimsu b'nei mamzerim. So it'll turn out that she was an Eshes Ish, thinking she was married to Reuven, and her children, with Reuven, in a case where there are children, will end up being mamzerim, kidduchashina b'magarish, right? Almanas shelo tivali leploni, right? If she says on condition that you should not have a physical relationship with Ploni, shema tivalo achar shetisalmein or achar shetiskaresh, right? But oda taktav leika lemechash yotzer me'abav yabicha. Mikomakum levi dekatani nami dei kedamin lekaman kasha. So the Gemara says, yeah, but that's only a chashash d'Rabbanan. And everybody agrees that if she were, to go ahead and marry somebody in the interim, and never invoke the Tanai, that the Kiddushin would be Chal. So you'd still have this case. Lisni nami lahach. Oh, so listen to this amazing thing. Tosa says, Ulaman de nafkala miachos sisha nicha. Tosa says there are two sources for the din of tsaras erva being patur, right? One source of tsaras erva's ptur is from the parsha of Achremos and the case of achos isha, meaning his wife's sister. That's the case. So the Tosa says, well, in order to qualify as an erva to be excluded from Yibam and Chalitza and to be pota, the tzara, if you learn out from achos isha, it should be somebody like achos isha. And if it's somebody like achos isha, then this Eshes Ish cakes wouldn't qualify. Why? Dilodami hach la'achos isha, da'almana shelo tinasi shari biznus, da'almana shelo tivai yichali liskadesh lo. Says, after all, what is the condition? Is the condition that she shouldn't marry Shimon. Well, let's say she went ahead and had a physical relationship with Shimon outside of marriage. If that wouldn't trigger the Eshes Ish, then it's not comparable to Achos Isha, which is, you can't marry her and you can't have a physical relationship with her because she's Erva. Or if it's the opposite, he says, Almanashlo Tinasi Shlo Tivali. But maybe if you marry her but not have a physical relationship, that wouldn't be a problem. Right. So Tosa says, let's say he said, let's say he said both of them. Let's say he said, Almanashlo Tinasi Velo Tivali. Would it then be like Akos Isha? So then finally Tosa says, Velo Dami Lakos Isha, Balmanashlo Tinasi Velo Tivali Nami. I choshev shir kama b'chutz miploni imkein shari kinisas la'achiv kodem va'afilu we lo choshev shir.
Contrary to din.
1 second. Lo dami la'achos isha. The hasam b'shas nefila hava achos isha. The difference is when you're talking about achos isha, the second that the nefila takes place, meaning that the husband dies, the second she becomes a yavama, right? So the candidate, she's already an erva to the Yavam as a candidate. Exactly what the Ramban said, but it took the Bali Tosa so much longer to get here, right? She's a grusha. She only would be an Eshes if she went ahead with the relationship. Ad shetivalo. And then he adds, even if you wanted to say, you know what, she really is an Eshes. Why is she an Eshes? Right now she's a grusha. She's an Eshes because vis-a-vis the potential of Yibum, the obstacle to Yibum is her being an Eshes. So in that respect, it's true that objectively she's not an Eshes right now because she got divorced from Abraham. She married Ruvain, and she hasn't violated any condition at this moment yet that makes her an Eshes. However, if you were to ask yourself, what is the obstacle to Sarah what is Sarah's obstacle from becoming Mrs. or the Yavama of Shimon? What would you answer? The obstacle is the Isur of Eshes Ish. So at the moment she's not an Eshes Ish, but Eshes Ish is a factor in obviating or precluding her Yibum.
But does this
so maybe vis-a-vis Yibum, she's an Eshes Ish, in which case you're back to the Mishnah.
retrospectively become a Tanai that's contrary to din of the Torah, which you're not allowed to do?
No, not at all. Only if she violates the Tanai, she'll trigger the Eshes Ish. There's no Tanai against the Torah. Tanai against the Torah is if you say, I hereby...
There's an obligation for Yibum, no?
No,
and he has now made it impossible. He's made it Tanai that makes it impossible for her to have Yibum.
Yeah, but that's not the content of the Tanai. That's just the coincidental.
So maybe whether it's via Brera or other methodology,
no.
Today,
a Tanai Keneged Torah. What is an example of Masna Masha Kosa B'Torah? A person gets married and he says, he formulates a Tanai, he articulates a Tanai that is against the laws of the Torah. Or he says to her, Harayat Mikudeshesli, but you can have an outside relationship. That's against the laws of the Torah. Here, he said, assuming it's a proper Tanai, Avram said to Sarah, I'm giving you a divorce. One thing I will not tolerate if you marry my old, friend, partner, but no longer are we on speaking terms, Shimon. Okay. And consequently,
all that's okay.
He doesn't have to marry Shimon. There's nothing about that Tanai.
If in the process of doing that, he obviates her ability to do Yibum, which is a deraisa.
It's all incidental, but it's not in the content of the Tanai. That's not so much because of the Torah. Okay. So Kivin Shemitah Meshasisha Surah Labam Mikom Mokom Lo Dami, even that isn't comparable to Achos Isha. Even if you want to say, the obstacle of this Yibum is Eshes Ish. Says even that isn't comparable. Why? Because if they were to go ahead and try to do Yibum, Kivin Shim Tiva Liyavam Shenasr Lav Hava Eshes Ish V'Lohoisa Eshes Achiv Miolam. Like if she were to go ahead, she wouldn't be an Eshes Ish. she would be no longer a Yavama. So the obstacle isn't Eshes Ish. The obstacle is there's no marriage to Reuven, and therefore she's not a Yavama. So that's not Eshes Ish. That today is in Tosa saying either you want to say the obstacle is Eshes Ish, and that would be like Achos Isha, and that would be an Erva. Even that isn't really true, because if there would be a physical relationship, it wouldn't be a violation of Eshes Ish alone. It would be a violation of Eshes Ish, but it would also undercut the act of it wouldn't be Yibum, because she would never have been married to the brother. Hilkach lo patra tsarasa. So it's not like a akosisha. Yeah, see how hard Tosis is working. The Ramban just said it's a Tanai. She's a grusha. We don't care what happens in terms of Ptur Tzara if they go ahead. Forget about that. The relationship per se is not a prohibited relationship. It's only a prohibited implementation. And look at the next line of Tosis, even better. Miu, Leman denafkale mivelakcha. There's another limud, right? There is another limud, and as such, in this other limud, right? The achos isha is not the paradigm. Right? Kasha. According to that view, if achos isha isn't there to provide a paradigm to exclude Eshes Ish, then Eshes Ish should really be an erva. Why? Because if you were to implement it, it wouldn't go. Anything you can't implement should be a tzara problem. Wow, is that really true? The answer is for Balitosis, it's pretty true. Because for Balitosis, they believe in Tchuya. And for Balitosis, they think everything is about the heter and the mitzvah being doche the law. So for them, even if she's not a Shem Eshes Ish, who cares? The implementation of Yibum, right, it would never be justified because it would always be Eshes Ish or worse. So Tosis says, right, Shlomer afagav de Levi Tani de ubeplukta kamairi lo kamairi the beplukta the spirale the tana de masis and kavase. Tosis gives a dochek other answer. Tosis says, you know what, you're right. According to this other makar, the law in this case would be that she's excluded from Yibum, she's excluded from Chalitza, and her co-wives are excluded as well. We would treat it like Erba. We just wouldn't quote it we wouldn't have it in the Mishnah because in the Mishnah, you know, they only count things that we paskin. We don't paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, we paskin like the Chacham. So there's a case for Rabbi Eliezer, not for the Chacham. It should be in the Mishnah. But in principle, so think what happened here, and here we're going to stop here. But the Ramban was saying it's a question, it's a mischievous question. A. B. In terms of the law, it's pasha. She's not an Eshes Ish. She's a grusha. There's no tzara. Then the Ramban said, you know what? I'm not even sure. Maybe there would be a zika and a chalitza. And the Rajbat thinks that there is a chalitza and a zika. But the Bali Tosfos are torturing themselves with this question. Not just the part why isn't in the Mishnah. In their 50% of the answer is in a chanami, there would be a p'tur tzara, and there would be no chalitza, and there would be no yibum.
Chalitza, you have to believe there's a yibum to the tzara. No.
What?
If you believe there's a chalitza, then that would make the tzara subject to yibum. No.
Yeah. Well, the Ramban and the Ramban's suffix and the Rajbat's conclusion is that there's chalitza and that there is no p'tur tzara. That's exactly correct. Yeah. But Balitosis are considering that there's even a p'tur tzara. Kolshkein, they likely don't believe there's chalitza, right? So what emerges is I'll finish this Tosis next time, but I have to stop here. But basically, the bigger idea in all of this is that for the Ramban and the Rajba, you know, the cases of the Mishnah are status cases. They're about candidates. They're about appropriate couples for Yibum. And therefore, the Eishes Ish case is a phantom. It's an ingenious phantom case. It's a case where Eishes Ish or some aspect of it would interfere with implementing Yibum, but it's not a case in which the candidate for Yibum is an Eishes Ish. She's a Grusha until there's some violation of the actual Tanai. She's a Grusha. Can everybody still hear me? I'm having trouble. My computer seems to I don't know why it's doing that. I'm going to get rid of that.
We can hear you and see you. We were able to, just lost you.
Can everybody hear and
Hear
see?
you. Now we can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to finish up anyway. But for the Ramban and for the Rajba, it's about, who is an appropriate candidate as opposed to an Erba. But for Bali Tosfos in general, this is consistent with their treatment of Rabbi Akiva. We'll see about Nida, other things, that for Bali Tosfos, the ability to implement Yibum legally without an obstacle, that is what we care about the most. The equivalent of Asid Ochalos, say. And therefore, Eshesish is a significant problem. Okay, so we'll stop here. I want to finish up this Tosas and talk about the Rajba Emir Hashem next week, and hopefully by then
Thank you.
We'll try to pin down better the schedule. I have to run because I have to speak, but to be continued.
Thank you.
Good night.